In this video, we will show you how to replace your neutral safety switch on this Acura MDX with a 3.7 liter engine. This will be located along the driver's side top of your transmission. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. To gain access, we're going to have to remove the air filter housing, but before we do, let's stop at the negative battery terminal. We have to disconnect this from the battery and set it aside. To do that, there's a 10mm mounting nut. Go ahead and loosen that just enough that you can remove the terminal end from the battery itself. A quick inspection for corrosion and we'll set that aside. Now we'll focus on the air filter housing. To be able to dislodge this, we're starting at the mass airflow sensor. Along the top of the sensor, you're going to have your connector locking tab. Just go ahead and squeeze on that. Once you have it disconnected, a quick inspection for corrosion. The wiring harness actually just sits along the back side of this tube. You can just slide it right on out of there. It's very simple. Continuing from there, we're going to start dislodging the upper air filter housing from the lower housing. This is held in place with 4 8mm headed mounting bolts. You could also use a Phillips head screwdriver if necessary. This one's tucked in back here. It's a little bit difficult to get to. We'll move from the mass airflow sensor. We're going to follow the air inlet tube all the way over to where your throttle bodies are located. Disconnect your wiring harness. It has a rubber boot, but on that rubber boot, it says push. That's right where the locking tab is, so we're going to squeeze on that. You can see right there, push. Quick inspection for corrosion. Continuing on, we're going to dislodge the air inlet tube from the throttle body. To do that, there's a small clamp here. We need to loosen it just enough that you can carefully start pulling it away from the throttle body. It's not going to go very far because we still need to loosen up this clamp and slide the tube out of the way. Now I'm going to be using some pliers for this clamp here. This is just a squeezable clamp. Slide that out of the way as far as possible. Take hold of that tube. We're attempting to slide it out of the air inlet hose. There we are. Continuing on, we're going to take hold of the air filter housing and the air inlet tube and carefully start pulling it away from the throttle body, removing it from the vehicle. There's that. We'll just grab that clamp in a second here. Continuing on from there, we can just remove the air filter, have a quick look at both sides. If it needs to be replaced, go ahead and replace it. Continuing on, we're going to dislodge the lower air filter housing from the area. Before we can start releasing the mounting bolts, we need to dislodge our wiring harnesses from its mounting points. You can see one right along here. We'll just make our way underneath there and gently separate that. Quick inspection as we continue on down the line. We have another one right here. Same process, carefully pry it out of place. Now as we make our way down towards this area of the air filter housing, we're just going to remove this 8mm headed mounting bolt, removing this entire bracket with the wiring harnesses still attached to it. Now we can remove our two 10mm headed mounting bolts holding this down. There's one pretty much right where that bracket was. Let's get that one first. Once you have movement from there, we're going to move to the outboard side close to the fender. Now we can take hold of this and lift it up and out of position. As we start to remove it, just be careful for your wiring harness. We do not want to cause any damage. A quick inspection of this and we'll set it aside. Now let's focus down along the rear of the battery and the battery tray. You're going to find that you have a wiring harness that makes its way across this area. We need to dislodge it. To dislodge it, take hold of the locking tab. We're going to lift up on that and then we should be able to slide this out of place. If you have a hard time sliding it, you may have to pry it with a small prying device. At this point, we can tuck the wiring aside and we can gain focus on the neutral safety switch itself. To disconnect the upper electrical connector here, it has a small locking tab. And to dislodge the locking tab, I'm using an angled pick. You can see that it has this gray lock here. What we need to do is make our way directly underneath the rearward side of that. You're going to find that there's a small tab that you can grab onto, pull on it, and then lift this up. Now as you start pulling on that, it should want to lift up and out of position. A quick inspection for corrosion, and we'll set it aside. Continuing from there, we're going to dislodge our wiring harness all the way down here, which is held in place with a 10mm headed mounting bolt. At this point, you can take hold of the wiring harness and move it around as necessary. We'll just go ahead and pull this towards the rear of the vehicle as far as possible without causing any damage. With that dislodged, you can tell we have ample room in this area to start removing our two 10mm bolts that are holding this in place. Once you do have those removed, you want to carefully start sliding this towards the driver's side of the vehicle, removing it from the shaft that's located on the transmission. With all the mounting hardware off of there and the wiring harness disconnected, let's go ahead and take hold of this and start sliding it towards the driver's side as I had mentioned. If you have a hard time pulling it off of there, you could carefully try using a pry bar. Just be extremely careful not to cause any damage to anything. There we are, that popped off. There it is, friend. Before we can get ready to install our brand new switch, the next thing we need to do is dislodge the shift cable from the shift lever. This should be fairly easy. You have a small locking clip. Once you have dislodged that and inspected it, go ahead and push this out towards the passenger side and remove it. At that point, the cable will be dislodged from the lever. There's our clip. Continuing from here, we have our pin. Now that we have that out of there, the next thing we'll do is turn this entire lever clockwise 2 clicks, which will put the transmission in neutral. Make sure you're very careful that the vehicle does not roll away on you when you do so. There's 1. 2 clicks, that puts it in neutral. This is facing pretty much straight up here. We can continue on with our installation. As far as cleaning this down, I'm going to use a piece of fine sandpaper and give it a light scuffing. We want to ensure that there's no miscellaneous damage or debris. Now just pay attention to each of our 2 mounting holes. And lastly, let's have a close look at the very end of our cable. I'm just going to give this a quick scuff on both sides. Now there should be a plastic bushing on this. Ours fell off. If yours is still in there, you can go ahead and take it out, give it a close inspection. We will be reinstalling that before we install the cable. Now we can install our neutral safety switch. The first thing we need to do before we slide this onto the shaft is ensure that the center is in the proper positioning. The way to do that is to look at the housing of the neutral safety switch. You can see that there's 2 small slots. And if you were to look at the center area here where the shaft protrudes out from the transmission and goes through, there's also slots. We need to ensure everything's aligned, so I just have this small stick. I'm going to put it right inside the groove, and as you can tell, it is aligned. If it's not and you need to adjust it, go ahead and turn the center one direction or the other until you're sure it's completely aligned, and you can go like this. Now we can start getting this in position. When we do put it in position and you're sliding it over the shaft, you need to ensure that you do not twist this in any way, otherwise it's going to not be clocked properly and you're going to find you have an issue. As I said, you want to be very careful as you're sliding it into position. You do not spin this. We'll press it on. After I've squeezed it on there, the next thing I'll do is continue on to making sure it's still properly aligned. You can use your feeler gauge if you have one. Just give this a little twist as necessary. We need to make sure everything's aligned, and you can fit it in there. That looks perfect. Now, while leaving that in there, let's continue on with our two 10mm headed mounting bolts. Start them in, snug them up, torque those to 8.7 foot-pounds. There's one. Once you feel as though you have it torqued, confirm that you're still properly aligned with your feeler gauge. Before we can put the cable into that shift lever, the next thing we need to do is pay attention to that bushing. You need to make sure it's on the passenger side of the cable. Once you have that pressed through, let's continue on with bringing this lever forward all the way to where it connects to the cable, and then we'll slide through the metal pin. I've got my bushing on there. You may have to twist the cable a little bit. Let's get this installed. This comes through from the passenger side towards the driver's side, and then we have that locking cotter pin. There we are, that slid right through. You can see it protruding out through the far side towards the neutral safety switch. We have our metal clip here. We'll slide it in, make sure it's completely locked in. You do not want this cable falling out of place while you're driving down the road. Once you have it pressed through, go ahead and try to take hold of it and try to tug it out of there. If it falls out, it's not locked in. Assuming it does not fall out, we'll continue on with our electrical connector. As for the electrical connector, we'll get this aligned, start pressing it down. As you press it down, you'll find it can only go so far before it starts pivoting this gray locking tab. Press the locking tab all the way down until you hear a click, and then give it a loving tug to ensure it's properly secured. Let's start securing our wiring harness now. All the way down on the transmission, we had the wiring harness that is secured with a 10mm bolt, so we'll start with that one. For this, I'm just going to take it, I'll press it down into the proper positioning. With it aligned, we'll start in the mounting bolt and snug it up. We have the large wiring harness. We're going to secure that into its mounting bracket. Just press it right in. Got a click from that. Let's get the lower air filter housing in place. When we go to put this in position, we want to make sure we align our two mounting bolt holes. Just go ahead and slide this right down in. Start in those mounting bolts. All right, before we tighten that, let's go ahead and start the other one as well. Let's get this wiring harness over here. Start in your 8mm headed bolt, snug it up. We'll move from there, following our wiring harness to the mounting points here. Press it in, listen for a click, make sure it's secure as you go. Continue on to reinstalling your air filter. We'll get this in position here, ensuring it's perfectly level. Now it's time for the upper air filter housing. Before we put in the mounting bolts holding the upper housing to the lower housing, we want to make sure we have the air inlet tube in place on the throttle body. We'll start bringing this over. We're aligning it with the throttle body, as I mentioned. Now, clearly we can't push it in too far. We still have to install our tube. Make sure you have your clamp on here. Our clamp was weak, and I don't like it like that, so I'm going to replace it with a brand new clamp. We're going to slide this tube in as far as we can into the inlet tube. As we continue on with that, we're also pressing this onto the throttle body. Make sure you press that all the way on. We're just gonna feel along the bottom side just to ensure it's properly seated all the way around. It's important to make sure that no dirty or unmetered air makes its way into the engine. After you're sure it's seated, tighten the clamp holding it to the throttle body. Take hold of the inlet tube, try to tug it off of the throttle body. Once again, it needs to be secured. Let's make sure this metal tube is completely slid into the air inlet tube. We'll tighten our clamp. On my application, I'm using a 7mm. If you still have the squeezable clamp, use that. Now it's time for the electrical connector on the top here. Press it in, listen for a click, make sure that's secured. We're making our way over towards that mass airflow sensor now. Get this secured on here. Now that we have that pressed in, let's continue on along the back side of the inlet tube. We're just going to secure the wiring harness into its mounting grooves here. Just press it right in there. Double check, make sure it's secured. Start aligning the upper housing with the lower air filter housing. Start in each of your 4 bolts and tighten them up. That one's started. All right, they're all started. Let's snug them up. Now we'll move along to our negative battery terminal. We'll take this, press it on there as far as possible, tighten your 10mm mounting nut. Confirm that's secure. You do not want a loose battery terminal. One last quick inspection in this area, and you want to test the functionality. To test the functionality, you want to attempt to start the vehicle in park, run it through all the gears, put it back in park and turn it off. After that, put the key in the on position, put your gear selector in neutral, and attempt to start the vehicle again. If the vehicle starts in neutral, go ahead and turn it back off, put the vehicle in park, and you're good to go. If it does not start in neutral, you need to make an adjustment on your neutral safety switch in one direction or the other. For some reason, something might not have been lined up properly. Aside from that, thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.